And now we have Josh Corman from the Use Case Group. So those of you who know me know that I do a decent amount of talking about SBOM, or perhaps never shut up about it, depending on your perspective. We sort of think about the framing group as the what is an SBOM, and the use cases group has really done a great job of drilling down into the why is a use bomb. Why is an SBOM? And oops, we've got a...
I sent my slides ahead of time.
You did. And the surface is quite annoying.
My co-chair was
All right. As he's pulling this up...
Undo what we did to set up art slides.
So when we last saw our heroes here in the use case group, we had a pretty well fleshed out document, and we were soliciting input on some other parts. We had 2 sections we had yet to write. I'm going to spend the bulk of the time I have on the 2 newer sections, but I'm going to briefly orient people to what we had done before in case you're newer to the process. In this document, we set up, oh, beautiful. So how do I click?
Just hit space.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, so we've had varying co-chairs on this over time. Lots of participants, and too many to thank specifically. Some of you, back to the vertical versus horizontal orientation, we've kind of taken a left to right idea that there's, in the nomenclature we've tried to use in the document so it becomes useful, is that there are individual parts, like an atomic written open source project that does a single thing. Compound parts, this could be things like a really big open source project like Apache Struts, or it could be a commercial thing like a real-time operating system, or it could be, industrial IoT platform like I build in my job. Then they ultimately get assembled into a final goods assembled, which is purchasable, sometimes regulated. In this case, we've used the metaphor of a bedside infusion pump made by a medical device maker, and then those get purchased by various operators or hospitals. Within every leg of this chain, the supply chain, right? Most of us are in the middle. Like there's upstream and downstream, but most of us are in the middle. And in a more detailed version of this and previous things we won't rehash, there were really 3 major categories per stakeholder. Looking for, if you're a Deming fan, it was choosing the best suppliers to depend upon, choosing the best supply from those suppliers during your go live testing or whatever, and then operational vigilance for the lifetime of that dependence to see new vulnerabilities or glitches or things to fix. What we've done in our paper and why, though, is we've argued this at more consumable on role, and essentially those roles will be listed here. If you just drill into the operator, even though all 3 of these roles exist at all legs of the chain, we left Deming behind, and we said there are people that produce software, there are people who choose software, and there are people who operate software. And the orientation of the document, I'm stealing this beautiful slide from a government employee, but these are some of those things that we went really deep on. And this way in the orientation of the document, if you're reading this document and you're in this role, this is what's in it for me, the WIFM, right? This is how can I benefit as a single part of a complex supply chain by having an SBOM or tracking an SBOM? What are the tangible benefits to my business? And they're not all security. In fact, most of the adoption you saw in the financial services world was massively increasing developer productivity by having less unplanned, unscheduled work, fewer break fixes, faster mean time to recover. So it became an operational boost, which is why it got a lot of legs, independent and irrespective of security. So those roles help someone who cares about why should I care about getting interested in the SBOM stuff? And it's very tailored. What we've done, though, and this is from last time, so what we've done, though, is we did have a placeholder that says the real benefits happen with network effect, and if we have compounding security debt with interest, what's the compounding benefit if we get it right? So we started introducing the concept, and now we have it in prose form of, could you accelerate the entire thing? Now, if you're from the medical world, there's this notion of patient health, which is the relationship between you and your doctor. How do we treat your ailments? But there's also public health, what's the system of hospitals, herd immunity, vaccinations, access to care, efficiency of care. So these are really taking a zoom out to say, could every single one of us that has a very localized benefit understand the system-wide benefit if you project into the future? And I want to applaud everybody in this project. It's hard to project into the future. If we had X, what would that look like? It's like taking apart a Lego diagram and projecting it into the future and seeing what happens next. It's not an easy thing to do. I think in hindsight, this group will look back and say, why did we not do this always? Like, this is such an obvious idea in hindsight, but projecting into the future is difficult, and I applaud the group that's done this. So again, we believe those system-wide public health benefits become dramatically accelerated vulnerability management in the foot race between adversaries and defenders, and we'll show a graphic in a moment. Number two is not just herd immunity as we start to choose better suppliers, but amplified herd immunity, because it's not a one-to-one thing like you would see with vaccinations, it's one-to-many. Number three is, we've debated over the name of this, but we believe a natural byproduct of this transparency will be that poorly maintained projects with incomplete SBOMs or no SBOMs who never fix their bugs will die off, or we will migrate away from their use, which also further amplifies the prior herd immunity concept. So notions that we will migrate towards higher quality suppliers. And then lastly, because it's just a feature of the system that some suppliers go out of business or get orphaned as open source projects. And currently that's a very disruptive event. In the presence of a world with SBOMs, it's a non-event. So quickly showing those graphics. Thanks again to our resident artist who spans a couple of these. We took those motifs of a parts supplier, a compound part supplier, a final goods assembled, and an operator with those shades of purple. And essentially, some of you have heard me say this before, but upon the revelation of a new vulnerability, there's a foot race between adversaries and defenders. The adversaries, I call it mean time to exploitation. So the mean time to exploitation now is being measured in days or weeks. That's the unit of time. The mean time to remediate for the multi-legged relay race here is measured in months and years. So we took an interview of one of our stakeholders who had a vulnerability in an open source project, took 6 months. So basically that open source project had a vulnerability. If we're looking at the top bracket, when they learned of it, 6 months to digest, fix it, test it, and safely, quietly communicate it to their customers. So that starts the next leg of the relay race. That little exclamation point is the first moment of notification for those medical device makers. They do some initial triage. They take it in, they test it, they fix it, they put it through its quality process, they check in with the regulator, they push it to the hospitals. So it's a multi-legged relay race that spans actual years, and we took the numbers from that actual disclosure. Imagine a world of SBOM, though, where this little yellow piece, which is the ability to mitigate while you're waiting for later remediation, if there's contemporaneous impact assessment of, oh, that hospital knows on day one that they are affected by this particularly bad thing, they may not be able to put out a patch. The patch is still being developed, but they can take mitigating controls or steps to either segment the network, shield it, take it offline, find some other alternative, increase visibility. But the idea of that foot race being compressed, it does not compress the work of later remediation, but it absolutely compresses the window within which people can know and respond. So mean time to identification, mean time to mitigation, while we pursue and wait for the longer term remediation. So this graphic can be stared at. Basically the top bracket is without SBOM, second one's with SBOM. And part of the idea here is to give a heads up to every downstream dependent, irrespective of what their manufacturers tell them.
Josh,
yeah.
Can I ask
Yep.
a question on that slide with that graph? It really depends upon the that the communication today is quiet communication, right? It's information that's provided often just to the consumers under certain circumstances.
Yeah, I would say we had more complicated ones. Maybe we should share them with folks later, but some of them are triggered by a public exploitation, in which case the whole world knows,
Sure.
But their hair's on fire. Some of them are quiet, coordinated disclosures,
Right.
through NDAs or customer relationships.
But in that case, you don't get, everyone isn't starting at the same time, right?
That's the top. So we took an actual story, start to finish, and the hospitals that were affected didn't know for quite some time. Yeah.
Right, but in order to do that, it requires a change in how vulnerabilities are communicated, in addition to SBOMs.
I'll take one more attempt for now to see if I'm hearing you correctly. In lieu of an SBOM, they're dependent on their notification from their vendor discreetly. In a world where they have SBOMs, they would know that, oh, there's a new flaw in log4j, version x.y.z. I have log4j, x.y.z.
Right.
Let me take precautions so I don't get hit by the attack in the wild.
But exploitation is advanced as well.
Yeah, potentially, yeah.
And if I heard Jim's point, the hospital would need a mechanism to know about the vulnerability in log4j.
Yeah, in fact, what some of the hospitals currently do is they'll take the SBOMs they've been given from their partial list of suppliers that provide them, and they have scripts that just watch the national vulnerability database and give them a local alert.
Right.
That type of automation, that's one of the key reasons we push so hard in day one. These should be machine readable and ideally in consistent formats, because that facilitates more machine speed vigilance versus human vigilance. I have a few more slides to get through, and we can come back to any of these if you like. Number 2 is the idea of herd immunity. So most people know that you have to vaccinate a certain percentage of the population before it takes root. When you reach a critical mass, like you have a population immunity versus individual immunity, it's harder for diseases to take root. We have a kind of a public health issue. One of the unrelated to this project, after the Mirai botnet, there was a lot of domestic and international, even state and local level people saying unpatchable devices with hard-coded passwords are a public health issue. So the herd immunity concept is if we vaccinate enough of them, or if enough of them are immune to these attacks, the attacks don't spread as fast. This is compounded, I'm dating myself here, but if you remember the Fabergé commercials of I told 2 friends, and they told 2 friends, and they told 2 friends, because these are one-end relationships at each hop, we get an amplification of herd immunity as we invest, or the inverse of that is current state is we amplify harm. But the amplification effect plus network effect was one of the concepts we have a bunch of pros on. Speeding up a little bit is we also believe in natural consequence. We've already seen this in the financial services folks. They start making lists called, one of the banks uses a list called a prohibited technology list. So as they get the SBOM, they scan for certain projects that are really risky or have burned them in the past. So as people start to scrutinize either abandoned projects, projects that can't provide an SBOM, other things, I think certain projects will have less dependence and will migrate and shift. I was talking to a major software supplier in the back who's already kind of doing that. A natural byproduct of transparency is we gravitate towards better goods. So we believe that this means some of those high-risk projects just won't get much patronage. So there'll be fewer and better projects, which is very Deming sounding. And then the last of these discrete ones we talked about is it's currently quite hard. The House Energy and Commerce convened a stakeholder meeting around the concept of SBOM a couple of years ago with a bunch of medical device makers and hospitals. One of the hospitals said, I don't need an SBOM. I can just, my vendor can tell me if they're vulnerable. And we pointed out how many devices they have where there is no vendor. The vendor's out of business. So one of the things that a manual business relationship depends upon is that your entire chain is still active, vibrant, hasn't been acquired and reacquired and end of life and whatnot. So in a world where we're baking in an SBOM at the time of creation, those SBOMs can live on much longer than the organization behind it. So this is more like future proofing. Sometimes we call it extinction proof or out of business proof, but that red spot becomes a blind spot for everything prior. But if we're concurrently providing that SBOM of the version delivered at the time of the creation or delivery, you have some resilience in the system. And then again, dating myself, but the combinatory effect of forming Voltron from all of these started to get really exciting. So we had a very short paragraph or 2 in there, which is if you can imagine any one of these benefits to the system, but putting them together, if we truly weed out the bad derelict projects and we amplify those higher quality, better maintained projects through network effect and amplification, and we can have prompt and agile notification at any leg of that relay race in the entire dependency tree, sideways, up, down, left, right, it starts to unlock some pretty cool things where we're not going to have 50 different versions of a competing library. We're going to have a couple really solid, well-maintained ones. If someone won't provide an SBOM because they're a free open source project with volunteers, people probably won't use it much anymore. Or if you have one that has a mean time, one of the ways the banks track this, or if you guys know, what's his name, Jim Ralph, who's been pioneering in this space, they would track the metrics of when there's a new vulnerability in these projects, what's the mean time to remediate for the project? And some MTTRs, 30 days. Some of them over a year. So as you start to track performance over time, because now you're able to measure them, it becomes much easier to know good from bad vendors or good from bad open source projects. So there's a whole bunch of combinatory effects and cumulative effects we start to explore. That section probably got the least review, but I would love people to poke at each of those 4 discrete ones or look at the combinatory. We left a few on the cutting room floor as well because we didn't want this to be a super long document. But again, it was accelerated vulnerability management across the whole relay race. It was the network effect for immunization or herd immunity multiplied by the one-to-N relationship. It was, we believe, inevitable secondary and tertiary effects of supplier selection or survival of the fittest supply. And then lastly, the ability to weather or persist on your use cases irrespective of the longevity of the supplier up and downstream in the chain. So I think that's what we have for a section. There's one more thing, which I think Bob Martin's here and will speak for himself when we open to comments. But the other section we added as an appendix was some of those higher assurance DoD things. And these would be things like provenance, pedigree, integrity, what's the chain of custody of this thing? So not just that this is the version number and some hash, but do we know who compiled it? Do we know who touched it along the way? Do we know where it was hosted? So some of those may be phase 2 or specialized use cases for national security level or military use cases. I believe they'll end up becoming pervasive use cases eventually in the free voluntary system, but there's some acute pressure to get this stuff tackled earlier, and we have a whole section on that now in the appendix. So the 2 newest sections in summary are we had the public health view versus the microscopic view of people who produce software, choose software, operate software. And also we tied it back to those selfish interests because any of the benefits you thought you might get as one of those 3 stakeholders only become better as the network effects kick in. So the active S-bombing will provide immediate value, but the longer term value of lots of people S-bombing provides significantly more value. To sound like a little kid, I got kind of giddy when we were writing that last section of the combinatory effects because it truly gets exciting when you project into the future. If these are more commonly available byproducts of build and packaging tools, and we gravitate towards things that can actually support these intents, the world looks a lot less vulnerable. I know that vulnerability management is but one of our use cases. I think it's a pretty critically important one since, like I said, mean time to exploitation is days and weeks. Mean time to remediation tends to be months and years. We've got to change the math. This is one way to change the math.
All right. Thank you, Josh. There's one other part of the document that I want to flag for folks, which is a set of related projects that highlight the potential for transparency. That this is something that we're seeing in all different corners of the community, whether it's the Business Software Alliance's Security Development Framework, or some older documents from various different sectors. So this is something that is useful to sort of see, oh, look, this is coming from a lot of different areas. This isn't just the people in the room who had this idea. This has been around for a while.
Oh, and I guess just to punctuate what Duncan said back on this graphic, so if I'm that white pipe, the compound IoT platform that's in a lot of medical devices, and that's my day job, by the way, if we stop at we use that white pipe, then you may not know that that hospital is vulnerable. If you go back a step and say, oh, there's a new vulnerability in some version of Apache Commons collections I'm using, then you'd say, oh, crap, I have something I have to do. So that's why we believe to support the minimum viable use cases for things like vulnerability vigilance for that, the operating environment, it does require multi-hop, which your framing group is agnostic to, fully appreciate that. When the rubber meets the road to actually give people, we want to have, one is more than 0. Multi-node, especially if it's readily available, is significantly more valuable. Very few comments.
Got a couple here.
Okay.
So I have a question. You are working right now on focusing survival of the fittest, but are you also focusing on how to improve the existing one so you use it as an education tool, for example?
Yeah, I mean, we wrestled over even how to describe that section, but there's an opportunity for projects that weren't doing good hygiene to say, oh, wow, we could do a lot better. Let's do that. There's other projects that have been orphaned for 10 years. I used to pay very close attention to consumption in Maven Central for all the Java projects. Very highly dependent upon projects with no committers, no activity, they don't fix any bugs, and people didn't know. So as we get a hard requirement from a bank saying you must have SBOMs, they must be comprehensive, the suppliers selling that bank are going to have to move away from some of those that don't participate. But there's every opportunity and encouragement that people get better at this. Yeah.
Thank you, Duncan Sparrow. So as you all know, I'm the one who's anal on the one hop versus, I call it full tree, because that's one dimension, how far deep you go. The other dimension is this whole concept of you don't actually know what's beyond you. I'm using Josh's product, but I don't know what's in Josh's product. So I can just say Josh's product. I can't say more because I literally don't know it. So unknown is different, particularly from the consumer's viewpoint, because part of the argument is, well, I'm going to use the medical device example because they're going to come up in the trial next. Is it the medical device manufacturer's job to go NHOP, at least to the extent they can, or is it the hospital's job to do NHOP? In other words, if the device says I use Josh's stuff, is it the medical devices manufacturer's job to talk to Josh and get the more, or is it the hospital's job to talk to Josh and get more? There's always the different dimension of you don't know what's out there, and that's a different issue, but just on the completing it. So my question for this document is, I know at least in the parts I wrote, I always assumed full hop. And I do agree with one hop is better than no hops, and 3 hops is better than, 2 hops. And there's, I can't go beyond what I don't know, but if I can, so the more complete it is, the better. But do we have anything in there on the concept of the more complete it is, the better it is?
I took a note on that. I think it's fair that we could show side by side or head to head. Because this is a Commerce Department voluntary multi-stakeholder process, my answer in this context is we could just talk about the relative benefits of both side by side. If you go sector by sector for people who may use this process later, like a regulator, the one regulator that's going to be here after lunch expects it for the medical device maker going through pre-market submissions or 510K changes to say what they're using on all the way down. The hospital market demand would be a market force. In this case, a regulatory force in that narrow use case is asking the final goods assembler. In other parts of the world, though, take this away, for physical supply chain, there's already case law and stuff for cars about the final goods assembler. That's why we use that word, is that a car maker is ultimately responsible if they choose a bad tire manufacturer because they chose it, right? So that's the McPherson versus Buick from 1916 or 17 or whatever. But final goods assemblers tend to be the accountability point. Yes, market demand could do that, but that's outside the scope of NTIA in this multi-stakeholder process. How it gets used, I think what we're building is something that's useful and can scale and support lots of use cases. How it gets used in other sectors, I think, will emerge organically.
Art Mannion. At the risk of repeating myself too much from the framing working group's point of view, and not to disagree with Josh's point about Buick, the final the name of the thing that I've got in my hands is who I'm going to go after when something goes wrong, and their choices are going to now come under question. The framing group sort of model is there's a least cost avoider component to this, and everyone does their little part. The thing works in theory very nicely, and that's really sort of the goal. So I don't want to have anyone have to go back, push back hops farther than they have direct knowledge of. If everyone just manages what they produce and make SBOMs for what they produce and demands SBOMs for the supplies they get, there's this beautiful graph puzzle that goes together and we have complete information. So that's the dream, at least my personal dream, right? Okay.
And to ground this very recent example, I just had to patch a flaw in my product that was a third-party component. I had a big fight with people. They said, it's not our fault, that's a third party. I said, it became our fault when we chose to depend on that third-party component, and our customers are going to scream at us, not that open source project. So it's a matter of opinion. It's just how people, the throat that's nearest to you to choke. And I vaguely mentioned the Buick versus McPherson, but as an example, that would be the Buick was the car. The Firestone tires, they were wooden, by the way, wooden wheels were breaking, and they sued Buick, and Buick said, it's not our fault, it's Firestone's. But the case rule was, as the final goods assembler, you in the best position to avoid risk in your complete finished good. So that would have been, say, a compound part or a single part. And we don't know what's going to happen with software. We're in new territory. But the notion of they're going to yell at me even though I depended on that third-party library, or they're going to look to scream at the person for the thing they're consuming, whether it's a toy or something else. It's just my prediction of how that's going to play out. But yes, to your point, if everyone does their part, it becomes much easier to do the whole thing.
So before we get too far in this today, I do want, and this may sound elementary, and and everybody here will say, duh, I'm sure, but I have gotten these comments outside of this group. And when you look at bill of materials and its definition, usually means what's in there, but we've gotten, I know you've probably built your own furniture from, I don't know, IKEA or something, but the bill of materials isn't wide. So the comments I've gotten outside of here is an SBOM truly wide, or are we just talking about deep? So I want to make sure we keep talking about deep and levels, but we want to make sure that everybody's on the same page, or at least the way I see it is it's a matter of wide as well. So it's your bill of materials. It's all your software that you are actually including that may not be IP. So I know it sounds elementary, but I have gotten comments, well, I'm just going to put, we look at this as those 10 big items, not those 15 other little items.
Yeah, and again, picture in the future that the way we write software, the tools we use to compose them, is just self-describing. You're not doing like some harvesting thing and tasking a bunch of interns. Think of Java right now. To make a build, you have to know what you're building from. So there's already sort of an SBOM in POM files, for example. So for these different ecosystems, imagine a world where the depth and breadth is a byproduct of making software. Now, that's a little bit North Star, and then the reality is going to be difficult in between. But that's what we're trying to cause, is a state where we have traceability throughout. Cars do it, and they do it with physical parts. They know every screw and every batch of screws from that supplier. Legos have a little unique number, little tiny pieces of plastic that cost less than a penny each. They know exactly which die and which cast and which position actually was defective. So that traceability exists. We can do the same with software.
I think that there's a tendency to focus on open source components, which is valid because everyone uses them and we analyze them. It's important to also discuss in the bill of materials that there may be licensed proprietary components within that same piece of software, which happens as well often. And we should probably get in front of this idea of what happens when a manufacturer considers the presence of a proprietary licensed software library to be a trade secret, for instance. So a software bill of materials has to include everything that's in it, even though you would rather not disclose that this special secret thing is in it that you've bought.
So I think this is not a complete satisfactory answer, but it has been covered in a lot of these working groups before. The way to compensate for some of the opaqueness of the 5 to 10% that is custom code or proprietary code is that the boundary becomes the final goods assembled has a version and a SBOM for it. So it is a trackable thing. And if there's a vulnerability disclosed against that combined thing with 90% transparency of open source projects and 10% of homegrown handwritten stuff, the boundary of being able to do the triage on that is that completed versioned thing. A step just above what you're saying.
So to follow that, what about, custom code is if your in-house custom code, right? That's your IP.
Yep.
What if it's a third-party dependency that is licensed? Yeah,
even,
sure,
even
except for the
unlicensed is
stuff that
licensed.
you've personally written.
All of them.
I mean, you can assume. Sorry. You can assume they're all licensed. I mean, it's possible to get one that's not licensed, but virtually all of them are Apache license or BSD license or something.
Sometimes there is a product that is sold as a software component into your product.
Sure, that's a vendor that you pay for. And there can be free ones and not free ones.
Sure, but the point is that at what point are you getting transparency on the presence of those products in your product?
And I think some of that falls in the broader conversation. The edge case that I think you flagged earlier is sometimes the terms of use explicitly says you cannot disclose that you're using this. This gets to, I think, some of the broader questions we're going to be talking about this afternoon, which getting into depth, getting into changing some of those norms. What's the short-term solution look like, which is something that Art talked about, and I think Kate's going to talk about, which is being very explicit about when we're not listing information, the known unknowns, and then the longer-term solution, which is, hey, if you're using this stuff, that's on you to work with the supplier that you're already paying to have some kind of awareness for vulnerability management.
Yeah, I think the short-term answer, in my own words, is we called it translucence or opacity, like a known unknown. I think my hunch is over time, people will tolerate fewer and fewer nodes in the tree that are opaque. I understand your use case, and I can even think of a vendor that's doing that. I don't know if that practice will survive, but I haven't thought about it that much.
So I've heard that concern also, that it's intellectual property, whether it's a trade secret or not, that it's considered intellectual property. And I believe the counter to that is really your use case of survival of the fittest.
That's right.
Right?
Yes. There's current state and there's future state, and I think we're going to go through some growing pains. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. Also, by the way, some of the early people that said which components we use are proprietary to us, and it's intellectual property, and it was a pretty easy to rebuff claim because many of those libraries they were using demand you acknowledge their use, and in fact, if you look on their websites, they're already acknowledged. So some of that was lobbyists spreading FUD. Some of it is, there's definitely terms and conditions in some high assurance use cases where people don't want to reveal the use of that. I think those things work out, to your point, as this gets more adopted. We'll have either accommodations for that or that practice will get squeezed. But a lot of the people who say this is proprietary intellectual property, I'm like, yes, it is for the project that's giving it to you for free. It's not yours, it's theirs. And in fact, if you don't acknowledge it, people have faced lawsuits, and that's one of the first sets of software composition analysis products was to avoid lawsuits for people violating the terms and conditions of open source licenses. So those cases, a lot of those claims are FUD. They're not all FUD, but we should be able to be adults and separate which ones are valid versus scare tactics.
If you're listening in on the phone, just a reminder that *1 gets you in the question queue. I'm also keeping an eye on email, so if you really want to watch the webcast rather than the phone, you can email me something and I will try to get it to you timely.
While people are submitting, Ben and I did some edits back and forth pretty last minute. So that section also, we're going to do a little bit more refinement on consistent tone and flow with the rest of the document. But there's some decent ideas in there, but that's really the area we'd love to invite you to focus on is which parts are super clear versus, more importantly, which parts are unclear. Because we're going to cut those out or we're going to clarify them.
All right. Any other comments, questions, demands? All right. This group, again, similarly has evolved over the past 6 to 10 months, and I think they've found something that is both covers really important things to say, as well as very useful things to say. I think all of these documents can be used, and this I think is going to be very useful for the folks who need a little encouragement to see why this is useful. This document is going to be very powerful.